Okay, welcome back to a new programming tutorial. In this video, I don't want to go into a specific programming language, but I just want to give you, from my personal experience, some ideas how you can learn any kind of programming languages, even multiple programming languages, in a reasonable amount of time. Yeah, and I want to explain how I have done it in the past, so maybe you can also benefit from that. So the idea is, or why I want to make this video, is because I was always asked by many people how to start programming. Many people even didn't have programming experience at all, and they just want to get into that, or they want to write scripts in root or programs in C++ for GN4, for example, or Python analysis programs, and they even have no idea how a programming language in general works. Yeah? And I was also confronted many times with the question, what programming language should I first learn? Yeah? So there are of course many possibilities. There's Python, C++, and so on. It's very difficult to say which is the best one, because each programming language is designed for a specific purpose, and maybe it will be less efficient for another purpose. So instead of learning each programming language separately, it is, from my point of view, much better that you learn the fundamental basics of programming, and then you can adopt this to any programming language, whatever you want to learn. Yeah. I myself have programmed in many languages. For example, I started with C++ by writing some root scripts or programs in GN4. Then I also wrote Python scripts for data analysis. Later, I did some bash programming in order to automate certain programs which I have created. Then I did some programming in PHP for websites with database connections and so on. Then also I did some analysis, data analysis with R from time to time. So there are many languages, maybe even more than I have mentioned here, which I use from time to time. But all of this, or all of the language, have in common that I never learned any of them in detail. Yeah? So I never took a book or tutorial and went through this step by step to learn this programming language, which is of course one possibility to learn it from scratch. But from my point of view, what is much better is, as I said before, to understand the fundamental concepts which are common for all languages, as a common denominator, you can say, for all languages. And when you once know these fundamental concepts, which I will explain now in this presentation here, then at the end you can apply this for any language, and then you know all the important stuff which you need to know in order to really start with your projects. And then after that, it is only learning by doing. You start programming project, which you want to do yourself, or which is a task given by your supervisor, and all the things which you need in addition to what I'm explaining you now, you can then Google yourself or find in books. Yeah? So I'm always following the principle that a working code is better than a good one, which means that you always still, after knowing the fundamental concepts, you will have to learn certain details about a programming language, to make it more efficient, for example. But all this refactoring and improving of code and so on, from my point of view, should be done at the end. The more important thing is that you know a programming language good enough to write some code and to run it. And after that, you are in principle fully prepared. And now, of course, the question is, what are these fundamental concepts which you have to know, which are really common in all programming languages? And I think personally that there are 6 which you have to know. And as I said, after that, you know enough in order to start with your own projects and really start programming. So the first one, I think, are data types and variables. So this is common in every programming language. Without variables, you cannot do anything in principle. You have to store values into the memory, and this you do by defining variables. And of course, you have to tell the program in some cases what type of variable you want to create. So you have to know what are integers, strings, and so on. Then in the second, the second fundamental concept, I would say, are arrays. One could even say that these are just variables, but I decided to put them into another concept because it's a little bit different way of thinking than just creating single variables. So it's a structured storage of variables or of items inside a variable. And then, of course, there are loops. In order to do really some procedural stuff with your program, you have to use loops, which are either while loops or for loops, and also they are common in every programming language. Yeah? So you cannot go around that. Somehow you have to use them. Maybe sometimes they are hidden behind other code, or they are not called loops, but in principle they are all working in the same way. Yeah, and then it also comes, of course, to the next concept, the conditions. Yeah, so you have to tell the program that do something under certain conditions, which is if and else normally it's called, and also Boolean connections you can make for and, or, and so on. And yeah, so conditions are very important. You have to know how they work. Then there are functions, because you sometimes really want to reuse code which you have created. You also want to make sure that some of your code only is only applied on certain positions where you insert your function. So this is a very important concept. And then if you go one level higher in object-oriented programming languages like C++ or also Python, you can insert classes. Yeah? And then when you understand these basics, as I said, you can apply them on any programming language, whatever you can imagine in principle. Yeah? So the language itself in which you program doesn't matter anymore. Yeah? You can then go through tutorials and search especially for these concepts, how to apply them to a certain programming language, and then you can save a lot of time and directly start programming. Okay, and as I said, I would like to start with variables, including data types. So in principle, the 4 fundamental data types which you have to know, which are also common in every language, are integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, -1, -2, and so on. Then we have floats, which are floating point values like pi, the number pi. Then strings, which are always connected to text, and booleans, which are true and false, which are especially required when it comes to conditions. Yeah? So sometimes you have also less or more data types. In some languages you have maybe complex numbers. In some of them you can also have unsigned integers, consuming then less memory, for example. But in principle, these 4 are the most fundamental ones, I think. And even you could argue that a boolean is also just an integer, which is 0 or 1. So string is also somehow, text is also saved as a type of integer. So in principle, you can even break this down to 2 fundamental types, which are integers and floats. But I would say these 4 you should keep in mind when you do any kind of programming in any language. Yeah, and when you know these data types, then you can really use them to define variables. Yeah, so here in the following slides, I would like to always compare C++ and Python to show how common these 2 languages are, but you can also adopt the same concept, as I said, to other programming languages. So when you take a look at PHP, for example, or Java, you will find out that they are very similar to what I'm explaining here. It always starts with variables, as I said. So here in C++, you have to define a variable by also specifying the type. Yeah, so for example, you have to write int for integer, then the name of the variable equal 5. Yeah, so now we store the number 5 in this integer variable int var, or any other name what you like to give. And the same you can of course do also for floats. Then you have to type in float as a variable type. Then the string you can define here with double quotation in C++, and also bool, the data type bool you can use in order to store the value true or false, which is 0 or 1, as I said. The same is also true for Python. Here, the only difference is that the data type can be omitted. Yeah, so you don't have to specify which type it is. You can just insert the variable in combination with the number, for example 5, or a floating number, or a string. This is a text in single quotation actually, or a true or false statement. Here in Python it's written with a capital T. This is the main difference here in this case, but the rest is same. Yeah, and then you can specify this type, of course, but you don't have to do it. Python automatically recognizes what data type you have according to what you enter here. Yeah? This is the main difference, but in principle both of them work exactly the same. And as I said, all other programming languages also somehow work very similar to that. Now, when you understand the concept of variables, we will come to arrays. And as I said, they are very similar to variables. In principle, an array is a variable, but you can store multiple items in this array. Yeah? And this is a very good way to store information in a structured way in your memory, and then you can later loop over the different items to do some processing with these things, which you cannot do with a single variable, of course. So in C++, the standard are just arrays. They are called arrays. You cannot do anything else with them except just storing things in that, and then later, as I said, process these values. Here in C++, you have to specify, similar to variables, you have to specify the data type, in this case, for example, integer, and you have to, or you can specify additionally the number of items that you want to store, and then in curly brackets you can enter the values 0, 1, 2, 3, and they are then stored in this array. In some cases you can also just omit the number of entries by just inserting 2 rectangular brackets without any content, and then C++ will automatically reserve enough memory according to what you enter here into that array that you create. In Python, there are also arrays available, but more commonly used are lists. These are the standard types actually for arrays in Python. And here the advantage is, again, compared to C++, that you can omit the data type, so you don't have to specify whether it's an integer or something else. So you directly can insert the name equal, and then in rectangular brackets you insert the items which you want to store in this array, and then this is in principle done, or in this list. You can also, one of the biggest advantage of Python compared to C++ is there you would have to use some tricks, but in Python you can directly insert different data types into a single list. So for example, this list here stores an integer 0, then after this the second element here would be a boolean, a true value, and then even a string ABC can be stored in the same list without having to create a separate list for all these values, which makes it a little bit more efficient, faster, and I think this is a very nice feature in Python, and this you also have in other programming languages. And always when you go then to the different languages, you should then try to just figure out in a tutorial or in on a certain documentation which you find that how lists and or arrays and variables are defined, and then you can directly start programming with that. And then when you know how arrays are working, and as I said, if you want to do some procedural programming with this, then you need to know what loops are. So actually there are 2 types of loops existing in almost every language, and these are for loops and while loops. So while loops are similar to for loops. Actually, I don't want to cover them here in this presentation, because I think it's very easy to find out what is the difference if you Google for that. But I just want to go a little bit into details regarding for loops and directly compare again C++ with Python. So in C++, you can define a for loop, as you can see here, by first defining the variable over which you want to loop. So in this case, I call this just I, which is commonly used in C++, and it should be an integer which starts at the value 0. Then it should go up to a value smaller than 5, which is 4. And then you can, and then here the third statement of this for command says then that it should always, in every step, increment I by 1. Now you can also decrement this by writing I minus minus, but in this case we want to just increment this. And then in every step of this for loop, we just want to add the value I to this variable sum that we define here in a line B above that. And then and then at the end you get the sum of all these values I which we have created here. So 0 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, and at the end, if I'm not completely wrong, the value which comes out should be 10. So this you can then give out here actually at the end. And then the same we will do now in Python, and in principle it's exactly the same. The most important thing is, of course, we don't have to put semicolon here. We define our integer sum equals 0, and here a for loop. There are different type of for loops in Python. You can also loop over an array just by inserting the items. But in this case, this is the way how to do this, similar to this code here, the standard for loop, you can say. So you write here for I in range 5, yeah, which means also again you create a for loop 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then again here you add this value of I to this value sum that we have defined here, and then at the end we print sum. So you see that although the syntax looks different, it's in principle doing exactly the same. Yeah? And you can do this in every programming language, only you have to understand the specific syntax in this. Yeah? Sometimes for loops are written in such a way, sometimes in such a way, sometimes it looks again a little bit different with columns and whatsoever, but in principle it's always the same how for loops and while loops are working. Yeah, and then of course when you loop, you also want to have conditions in this. You want to have a code which is only running under certain conditions. For example, you want to break your for loop, you want to continue, you want to check whether a statement fits to another one, and so on. So what you need are these so-called if-else conditions. And again, this is the same in every programming language that you can imagine. Somehow it always works the same. So here again we create a for loop from 0 to 5, and then within the for loop in every step we check if the value I is equal to 3. If this is the case, then it should break the loop, so it just stops. Or if this is not the case, it should continue, so everything else below this would be just ignored. Yeah, it's a complete stupid arrangement of statements here which I put, but it's just to really show how such if-else conditions are working in C++ and how, for example, in Python they are looking like. And here on the right side in Python you see you do it exactly in the same way. You loop over I from 0 to 4, and then you check here if I is equal to 3, then break the loop, or else if not, then continue. So the code in Python is shorter. It's a little bit more maybe straight to the point, although you can also make it in C++ a little bit shorter if you want. But from my point of view, yeah, what is also different here, of course, this I have shown already in the previous slide, that in Python you don't have curly brackets, you have indents here instead, which have to be kept. But somehow the concept, this nested programming for loops and for conditions and so on, this is exactly the same in all programming languages. So you should really understand what are conditions, what are loops, and then you can easily learn every programming language. Yeah, and then of course if you write code, you want to reuse this, as I said before. You only want to call code when it's actually needed on this position. Yeah, so in this case you use actually functions. And functions have the advantage, they always return a value of a specific data type, and they also take parameters. So you can hand over parameters to a function, do some procedure in this function, at the end you return a value, and this you can then use in your program. So for example, here I have a very simple function that I created for C++ to create or to calculate the area of a rectangle. Here in C++, it's very important, again, that you specify the data type. This is throughout the whole language very important. So C++, maybe in modern C++, I'm not so much familiar with new standards, so it could be that maybe it's not necessary anymore, but at least to the original C++ standards, it has to be like that. So here, in this case, we create a function called area, which should return a float value, floating point value. And it takes over two arguments. One is side A of a rectangle and one is side B of a rectangle. And then at the end, the function is not doing anything else except calculating A times B and then returning this. So then at the end, you can take over this value and hand over this to a variable. You can give this out in the terminal or whatsoever, and then you can really use that. You can also directly implement this in your code, but here the advantage is that if you have to calculate the area more often than only one time, then a function is very nice because you can reuse it again and again, as I said. And in Python, this is much shorter. Okay, it's also not much shorter, but the way of defining a function is a little bit different. So here again, we don't have to specify the data type. We only have to write def for functions, area, then the arguments AB, and then return AB. And according to the arguments that we insert into our function, and according to the product which is calculated here, Python already knows that this has to be a float. floating point value and then also returns this as a floating point. Yeah? So this is an advantage in Python. It's much shorter to write. It's faster. And here I accidentally inserted the semicolon. Of course, this is stupidity here. You can ignore that. Yeah? So yeah, this is in principle everything related to functions. And if you understand this fundamental concept, then as I said, you are quite good prepared for other programming languages also. And then as the final step, I would say classes. These are very important, especially when it comes to object-oriented programming in modern languages. And you will come somehow to know about this. So they are actually user-defined data types. Okay, going too much deep into the meaning would maybe exceed the limits of this video, but I just want to show you that these things are existing and that these are part of the things which you should know when you learn a new language. Yeah? So a class we can here in C++ define very easily by just using this class statement here, and then hand over. Then this is the constructor here in this class, which I just called my class, but you can also call it differently, of course. And then in this constructor, when we create this object, we want to hand over an argument which is called x, and then when we construct this class, it should give out this value x. Yeah, nothing special, just for testing purposes. And then here in the last line, we create actually an object called obj, and we insert this argument 3.14 into that. And at the end, when you run the code, it will just do nothing else except printing out this value. Yeah, so it's very simple. Maybe it's also defining the purpose of a class actually, but as it is just for explaining what it is and how the difference are between C++ and Python. So in Python, you can do it in a very similar way. The class statement is also identical actually. Here you have to use indents again instead of curly brackets. And the constructor, for constructor, you have to write def init self statement, and then x, this is the argument, again similar to here, and then print x for just printing out the value. And then at the end you can just create an object with this last line here, obj equals my class 3.14, and when you run the program, very simple, it just returns the value or gives out the value in the terminal 3.14. Yeah, and this is everything. I think yeah, so these are the things which I learned, and then I used them to learn many other programming languages, and then you can adopt these to other languages even without really learning them completely. Yeah, so sometimes you can just find all the things which you need just by looking in different forums, tutorials, books, Google it and so on, and this is completely sufficient. Yeah. So yeah, I hope that you liked the video. I hope that it was beneficial, that especially when you start with programming in a certain language, then maybe you can use this method, which I have used several times successfully, and it will hopefully help you a little bit in your programming time. And as I said, when you know a language good enough that you can write a program in this, just do it, write the program, and at the end, when you think it's maybe too slow, it consumes too much memory or whatsoever, then later try to improve that, make it more efficient and so on. But from my point of view, really that when you have a code which runs, which can do the analysis for your thesis, for your paper which you have to write and so on, this is much better than spending a lot of time in learning all the fundamental details of one specific language, and at the end you just waste time and you still don't know the language exactly. Okay, yeah, I hope that you liked the video. If you like it, please hit the like button. If you have any further suggestions for maybe future videos, put it into the comment section. Subscribe my channel if you have not done so far, and hopefully see you soon for another programming video.